This Notebook LM video explores the dramatic changes in Christianity over its first 3 centuries. Following the apostles, the faith split into several groups, each certain they preserved the true teachings. This journey reveals how unity emerged through conflict, organization, and resilience, though it came at the cost of silencing alternative forms of Christianity.
All right, we're jumping right into a story you think you know, the very beginnings of the Christian faith. But trust me, it was way more chaotic and creative than you might imagine. You know, most of us have this picture of early Christianity as this single, unified movement, right? Jesus, his apostles, and then it just kind of grows from there. But the real story? Oh, it's so much messier, more conflicted, and honestly way more interesting. It wasn't a straight line at all. It was more like a total free-for-all, a real battleground of ideas, with all these different groups fighting over what it even meant to follow Jesus. So the period we're zeroing in on is called the Ante-Nicene period. Now, what does that mean? Well, ante means before. So this is the time after the original apostles were gone, but before the faith got its official rule book at the famous Council of Nicaea. Think of it like the Wild West of early Christianity. Seriously, everything was up for grabs. And that brings us to the first huge problem for this new religion, a massive identity crisis. I mean, think about it. The original leaders, the apostles, they're gone. So now what? The biggest question on everyone's mind was, who's in charge now? Who gets to say what it really means to be a Christian?
With no one officially in charge, interpretations of Jesus' teachings just exploded everywhere. It was a total powder keg. In fact, historians have this amazing phrase for it, a violent creative ferment. Just picture it. Dozens of different Christian groups all popping up across the Roman Empire, and every single one of them is absolutely convinced that they have the one true version of the faith. It was a fierce competition for followers.
So yeah, this wasn't just a friendly debate. It was a war of ideas. And we're about to look at some of the really radical alternatives that came so close to becoming the Christianity we know today. Okay, so the group that eventually won out, the one that would become what we think of as mainstream Christianity, scholars call them Proto-orthodox. Proto meaning first or early. And they needed a way to shut down the competition, right? So they came up with a powerful label for any other belief: heresy. But it's so important to remember this. Heresy is just what the winners called the ideas of the losers. And when you look at what these groups actually believed, wow, I mean, they were worlds apart. The Proto-orthodox, they believed in one God, creator of everything, pretty straightforward. But the Gnostics, they thought the physical world was a mistake made by some flawed, lower-level god. They called him the demiurge, and that the real God was totally separate from all this mess. And then you have the Marcionites, who took it even further. They said there were 2 gods, the harsh, angry God from the Old Testament, and then the completely separate, loving God that Jesus talked about. We're not talking about small details here. These were basically different religions fighting it out. So, how did the Proto-orthodox guys fight back? Well, leaders like Irenaeus of Lyon had a killer argument. It was all about authority. They basically said, listen, our teachings come directly from the apostles who got them from Jesus. It's an unbroken chain. We have the original, authentic version. Everyone else, they're just making stuff up. So how did they do it? How did this one group manage to pull together a completely fragmented faith and win this war of ideas? Well, it wasn't just about having the best arguments. They were brilliant organizers. They built a system. They knew that if you want to bring order to chaos, you need rules, you need structure. So they developed this toolkit for unity, a set of practical tools designed to build one single unified church that worked the same way whether you were in Rome or Egypt or anywhere else. And their strategy was basically a 3-pronged attack. First up, create a clear chain of command with bishops in charge. Second, decide on an official list of sacred books, the canon, what we now call the New Testament. And third, appoint to the writings of trusted teachers, the church fathers, as the go-to guides for correct belief. Now, the absolute key to making this whole thing work was this idea called apostolic succession. This was Irenaeus' brainchild, and it was genius. He argued that a bishop's authority came from a direct, unbroken line, like a spiritual family tree, all the way back to the original apostles. This was a game changer. It meant a bishop could stand up and say, I have the authority from Peter himself to tell you what's right and what's heresy. And creating that official book list was just as crucial. Back then, you had tons of different gospels and letters floating around. So by saying, nope, only these 4 gospels are legit,
They could control the narrative. They basically defined the source code for the faith. And in doing so, they cut off the oxygen to rival groups who relied on those other texts.
Okay, so while all this internal fighting is going on, there's also a huge threat coming from the outside. And ironically, this external enemy would actually end up making the Proto-orthodox Church way, way stronger.
And that threat was, of course, the Roman Empire itself. Now, the persecution wasn't happening all the time, everywhere, but when it did happen, it was terrifying. The big problem was that Christians wouldn't worship the Roman gods or the emperor. To the Romans, this wasn't just a religious issue, it was treason, and it was a crime that could get you executed. As you can see, this persecution wasn't constant. It came in brutal waves. You'd have decades of relative peace, and then bam, an empire-wide crackdown. But you know what they say, a common enemy brings people together. And these periods of intense persecution forced the different Christian communities to get organized, to unify, just to survive. When your life is on the line, you need clear leadership.
And then, everything changes. After centuries of fighting amongst themselves and being hunted by the empire, the entire game is about to be turned completely upside down. This is one of the biggest plot twists in history. The Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. Can you even imagine? The very faith that his predecessors had tried to stamp out now had the most powerful man in the world as its #1 fan. Now, this didn't happen in a single day, but it happened fast. First, in 311, an edict comes out that basically calls off the last big persecution. But the real turning point was the Edict of Milan in 313. That's the one that made Christianity legal across the entire empire. For the first time, Christians could worship openly without fear. So before all this, what are we talking about in terms of numbers? Well, best guess is that Christians made up maybe 10% of the population. A pretty small but definitely dedicated minority. But then, just 50 years later, 50! Look at that. The numbers just explode. From a small minority to the absolute majority religion in the empire. Suddenly, being a Christian wasn't just safe, it was fashionable. It was good for your career. The incentives had totally flipped. Now, Constantine was a practical guy. He saw Christianity as a potential glue to hold his empire together. But all that infighting wasn't helping. So, in 325 AD, he calls a meeting, the Council of Nicaea. He gets all the bishops in a room and basically tells them to sort it out. And they do. They hammer out a single, unified doctrine, the Nicene Creed. And that's it. The war is over. The Proto-orthodox faction, with the emperor's blessing, had officially won. So in the end, this journey from a persecuted minority to the official religion of the empire, it was a victory for sure, but it was a complicated one. I mean, the faith had survived and won in a way nobody could have predicted. But what happens when a religion of the oppressed becomes the religion of the powerful? By winning the support of the empire, Christianity didn't just end one battle, it started a whole new one, with challenges and consequences that would echo for the next 2,000 years.